Which of the new champions is your favorite? It's tied. Perhaps my favorite deck in card games ever. He's my favorite champion. It's my favorite deck in Runeterra. Favorite archetype. This is still my favorite deck, but it's exact lethal. You know, the 0. That's my favorite kind of lethal. My new favorite deck. Heimerdinger is my favorite champion. Like I said, my new favorite deck. This is my favorite region. It's my favorite deck. 0 mana Teemo. My favorite type of Teemo. My favorite champion, and my favorite one being the Teemo Bat Trip deck. It's one of my favorite decks ever. Favorite guy again. This is one of my favorite decks. Green Glade Caretaker is one of my favorite 1-drops in the game. My favorite mid-range deck in the game. It is my favorite mid-range deck, perhaps my favorite deck in the game. Honestly, mixing these two, which are my 2 favorite champions in the game, is, my favorite region combination to play Heimerdinger in. Today, I'm going to combine 2 of my favorite things in Runeterra right now, and that is Mushrooms and Final Spark. Heimerdinger, you know, who is my favorite champion. Puffcat Peddler is like my favorite follower in the game. I love this archetype. It's one of my favorites. It's optimized, upgraded version of one of my favorite decks in the game. This card, Jinx, is one of my favorite archetypes in Runeterra. Heimerdinger Control is my favorite archetype. Where it comes from a competitive standpoint, it's playing one of my favorite decks, Heimerdinger Control. Battering Ram deck that I've showcased on this channel a few times, right? One of my favorite decks in Runeterra, by the way. And one of my favorite decks in Runeterra, this is like one of my top 5 favorite decks. One of my favorite, if not my favorite follower in the game. It's just not one of my favorite regions. Out of all the aggressive archetypes, this is my favorite. It's definitely my favorite aggressive archetype, for sure. It's one of my favorite archetypes. Definitely my favorite aggressive archetype. Like I said, this is my favorite aggressive archetype. Callisto was one of my favorite champions in the preview beta. It's one of my favorite factions, actually. And because it's also one of my favorite decks that I've ever built, it's definitely one of my personal favorites. It's my favorite channel on YouTube. Kutzergast. Got to play some Heimerdinger Lux, which is one of my favorite champion combinations. One of my favorite decks. My favorite aggressive deck. My favorite deck of the lineup for sure. This is perhaps my favorite one. Yasuo is my personal favorite. I'm not honestly a big fan of all of them. He is one of my favorite champions. My favorite champion up until now from the reveals. Piltover and Zon. You know, it's my favorite region. Brains and Bronze, one of my old favorites. I want to showcase one of my favorite champions in the... My 2 favorite champions in the entirety of Legends of Runeterra here, Heimerdinger and Draven, are my top 2 favorite champions. One of my favorite decks of all time. Because he is one of the characters in one of my favorite cinematics from League of Legends. The Legends Never Die cinematic. It's one of my favorites by far. What's there to say about this card? One of my favorite followers and one of my favorite combos is with Tiana Crown Guard. This is like my favorite Bilgewater champion revealed so far. Oh, is this guy my favorite? This guy may be my favorite, but these 2 are by far my favorites. Which is one of my favorites, actually. And this is one of my favorite designs over in Zon, which is in fact my favorite region. Swain is one of my favorite champions from Rising Tides. This is my favorite deck. This is my favorite deck, right? I say this quite a bit. Fuck that shit. This is my favorite deck. I'm just gonna say it. I love it. Perhaps my favorite new mechanic introduced with Rising Tides. I think the spell mana is my favorite thing about Legends of Runeterra. Champion that I hold very dear to me, and that's another way of saying one of my favorite champions. She's one of my favorite champions. Is one of my favorite followers introduced with Rising Tides. Twisted Fate has become my favorite champion. This has become one of my favorite decks for sure. Puffcat Peddler is my favorite follower. I love this card. One of my favorite cards from Bilgewater. He's one of my all-time favorite decks. This is my personal favorite way to play aggressive decks. Twisted Fate, my favorite champion.
We might also bring back your favorites in the future.
It's got some of my favorite cards and mechanics. You know, I know I say this a lot, but he is one of my favorite champions. Demacia is my least favorite region. No mystery that Demacia is my least favorite region. Lux is one of my favorite champions. She's easily my favorite champion in Demacia, like by a long shot. Demacia Ionia is my least favorite region combination. Puffcat Peddler, I've said it numerous times, is my favorite follower. It's personally my favorite variant of Lux. He's actually like in my top 5 champions. Like actually one of my favorite champions. Because Twisted Fate is in fact my favorite champion, but he's actually my favorite. Ridiculous. It's why it's my favorite champion, man. I really hate him or anything, but I don't know. He's not one of my favorite characters in the Runeterra universe. Wise, and honestly, it is my least favorite region combination. I came to tell you that I love watching you play Twisted Fate. He's my favorite champion. and I'm able to mix her with my favorite champion in the game. This, yeah, it's definitely up there with my favorite decks of all time. My favorite combo is obviously with Teemo. It's one of my favorite decks that I've made up until now. Yasuo is my second favorite champion. Tyler 1's favorite champion is Heimer. Is it his favorite champion Draven? My favorite deck in the game, because this is the hardest deck to play for me, and that's why it's my favorite, amongst other things. This is my favorite deck. Memes aside, it actually is my favorite deck. Deck building is my favorite aspect of card games, not one of my favorite decks. I do love recording for YouTube. That's always been my favorite thing. Karma is not he's one of my least favorite champions. Out of all the meta decks right now, this is definitely my favorite. Draven's one of my favorite champions. I really loved that mid-range metagame. It was my personal favorite. Yasuo is my second favorite champion, which is interesting because Heimerdinger is actually one of my favorite champions. Mogwai and all of his champions are his favorites. I actually loved Heimerdinger. It's my favorite. It actually is. This is my #1 favorite deck. I'm excited to, make my comeback with my favorite deck. It's not my favorite deck. Memes incoming.